A gravedigger finds a suitcase full of money buried in a cemetery. But when he decides to keep it, he unleashes a chain of secrets, corruption, and a deadly showdown that will change his life forever. How far will he go to survive and expose the truth? The metallic sound of the shovel hitting the wet earth broke the silence of the cemetery. Jorge, with beads of sweat on his forehead, worked under the dim moonlight. It was a cold and lonely night, like all the others. The businessman who had died days before was to be buried at dawn, and Jorge, the town gravedigger, was used to preparing everything without company or hurry. But that night was different. As he dug the hole, his shovel struck something hard, unlike the rocks that usually lurked beneath the earth. He bent down, curious, and began digging with his hands. What he found took his breath away. An old leather suitcase, dirty and worn by the years. He opened it with trembling hands, his eyes lighting up as he discovered neatly packed wads of cash. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. For a few moments, he stood paralyzed and unable to understand how something like that had ended up buried in a forgotten corner of the cemetery. But the temptation was stronger. He looked around, making sure no one was watching, and decided to take it back to his little cabin. When he arrived, he slammed the door shut and shoved his suitcase under the bed. His heart was pounding, torn between elation and fear. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dancing shadows cast by the candles on the walls. He couldn't help but think about what this fortune could mean, a way out of his monotonous, deprived life. But a strange weight began to settle on his chest, as if something or someone was watching him. That night, as he tried to sleep, strange sounds began to come from the cemetery. Branches rustled as if someone was walking among the graves. The wind carried with it a murmur that seemed to form words, although Jorge could not understand them. He tried to convince himself that it was his imagination. The tiredness was playing tricks on him. But every time he closed his eyes, the image of the suitcase came back to his mind, accompanied by a feeling of unease that he could not ignore. When he finally got out of bed, he looked out the window towards the cemetery. Among the tombstones, he thought he could make out a dark figure that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. That night, the cemetery held not only graves, but also secrets that were beginning to be unearthed. And Jorge, unwittingly, had taken the first step towards something that would change his life forever. Dawn brought a deceptive calm. Jorge woke up after a restless night, feeling as if something dark was closing in on him. His small, humble cabin seemed more claustrophobic than ever, with his suitcase hidden under the bed. Translated from Spanish to English, www.online.doctranslator.com noise. Every creak of the old floorboards made his head turn in shock. The weight of the secret he now carried was greater than he had anticipated. He tried to go about his day as usual, but his shaking hands betrayed his nervousness. As he made coffee, his gaze kept drifting to the corner where he had hidden the money. What if someone already knows? He muttered to himself. Paranoia was beginning to consume him. He decided it was best to keep a low profile, but that wouldn't be as easy as he thought. Several miles from the cemetery, in the small offices of a local newspaper, Mariana was scanning documents with sharp eyes. The young journalist had received a tip about a multi-million-dollar embezzlement at the mayor's office. The missing funds were intended for public works, but they never reached their destination. Mariana, known for her determination and nose for corruption, suspected that the mayor, Antonio, had something to do with it. The deceased businessman could have been a key player, she thought as she organized her notes. Rumor had it that the man had been the local government's main contractor, and his sudden death raised too many questions. Mariana decided the cemetery would be the ideal place to begin her investigation, but she had no idea she would find much more than just graves there. Meanwhile, Jorge struggled with his conscience. He tried to focus on his daily tasks, cleaning tombstones, cutting dead grass, and digging small repairs in the grounds. Yet every time he saw a tombstone, he couldn't help but think of the suitcase and what it might mean if someone found it. "What will I do with all that money?" he asked himself over and over again. The answer seemed more complicated with each passing hour. At night, sitting in his cabin, Jorge opened his suitcase once more. The glow of the bills under the candlelight was hypnotic, but also unsettling. He thought about using some of that money to fix his life, buy new clothes, improve his house, maybe even leave the village. But the shadow of guilt followed him closely. It was as if the cemetery itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. While he was silently struggling, Mariana was already preparing her first visit to the cemetery. There was something about the connection between the businessman and the missing funds that wouldn't leave her alone. Although she didn't know it yet, her steps would soon cross Jorge's path, and her investigation would begin to unearth more than she had planned. Night fell again, and the strange sounds in the cemetery returned, a reminder that buried secrets never stay hidden for long. Jorge walked through the dusty streets of the town with a bag under his arm. Inside, he carried new tools, something that did not go unnoticed by the neighbors. "Where did he get the money for that?" murmured Doña Clara from the window of her shop, watching him with curious eyes. Jorge, however, kept his gaze down, trying to go unnoticed. He had used a small part of the money, but each expense seemed like a public confession. Meanwhile, Antonio, the mayor, stood in his office, his face tense. In front of him, an assistant was reading out the results of an audit. Millions of public funds were missing. Antonio clenched his fists. He knew perfectly well who had had access to that money, but the deceased businessman was not in a position to answer questions. "If someone finds that money, we could be in trouble," he said in a serious tone. He looked out the window, his mind already calculating possible moves. In the village, rumors began to spread. Jorge did not usually buy new things. His humble lifestyle was known to everyone. When he was seen with high-quality tools, speculations were quick to appear. Some thought he had received an inheritance. Others, that he was involved in something shady. For Jorge, the atmosphere was getting heavier and heavier. Eyes followed him like shadows, full of suspicion. In the midst of this, Mariana arrived at the cemetery with her notebook in hand. Her research had taken her there to find information about the deceased businessman, but her attention soon turned to Jorge. There was something in his behavior that caught her attention. He worked in silence, avoiding any eye contact, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. "Have you been working here for a long time?" Mariana asked, approaching him. Jorge, surprised, quickly straightened up, dropping a tool. "Yes, many years," he replied in a muffled voice. The journalist smiled, but not out of kindness. Her instincts told her that Jorge had something to hide, although she wasn't sure what. Antonio, for his part, decided to send one of his trusted men to the cemetery. "I want you to keep an eye on everything that happens there. Someone knows something," he ordered firmly. He knew that this place could be key to solving the mystery of the missing money, and he was not willing to leave any loose ends. That night, Jorge sat by the window of his cabin, feeling the walls closing in around him. His small expense had unleashed a chain of suspicions that were choking him. Outside, the wind blew hard, and among the rustling of the branches, Jorge thought he heard something else. The echo of footsteps, as if someone were watching him. In the village, Mariana was reviewing her notes. "There's something about that man," she thought. For Jorge, the night would not be peaceful. The eyes watching him were more numerous than he imagined. The icy wind blew through the cracks in Jorge's cabin, making every corner seem to whisper. He had spent the whole day feeling the pressure of the stairs in the village, and as night fell, all he wanted was to forget. But the cemetery gave him no respite. When he closed his eyes, images of buried money and graves haunted him. A noise woke him up suddenly. It was a rustling sound, soft but unmistakable, as if someone was walking on dry leaves near his window. He stood up immediately, his heart pounding. He looked outside, but everything was dark. However, something was not right. He opened the door slowly, with a flashlight in his hand, and walked toward the cemetery. As he walked, each step seemed to amplify his anxiety. In the distance between the tombstones, he saw something that made him stop. The earth next to the place where he had buried the suitcase was untouched. Someone had been there. His blood ran cold. Had they found the money? He hurried to check, digging with his bare hands until his fingers touched the rough leather of the suitcase. It was untouched. Despite the momentary relief, Jorge knew he couldn't stay there. He would return it to the cemetery, but not to the same place. He spent the rest of the night looking for a new hiding place. Finally, he decided to hide it near an old abandoned crypt, where no one would dare to approach. But even there, as he covered the suitcase with dirt, he felt as if someone was watching him from the shadows. He finished his task and returned to his cabin, his body exhausted and his nerves shattered. The next day, Mariana arrived at the cemetery. She was wearing a thick coat and carrying a tape recorder. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but something about the place told her there was more than met the eye. She found Jorge working next to a tombstone, cleaning it with unusual delicacy. She decided to go over there. "Has anything strange ever happened here?" she asked, pulling out her tape recorder. Jorge looked up, clearly suspicious. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he replied curtly, turning back to his work. Mariana tilted her head, noticing his tension. It must be a lonely place, spending so much time among tombs. Jorge didn't answer. His silence only increased the journalist's suspicions. That same night, as Jorge tried to sleep, the sounds returned. They were clearer now, footsteps stopping near his window, whispers mingling with the wind. He got up with his heart in his throat, but he didn't dare look. Outside, the shadows seemed to move, as if the cemetery were alive. Jorge knew he couldn't go on like this. The money, although well hidden, seemed to have a curse that haunted it. In the darkness of his cabin, he made a decision. He had to get rid of that suitcase before it was too late. But the questions that tormented him remained unanswered. Who had buried it, and why did he now feel like he was being watched? The cemetery was quieter than usual, but Jorge knew he was not alone. From the window of his cabin, he watched as two figures moved among the graves with lanterns. The beams of light danced between the headstones, briefly illuminating tense faces. They were men sent by Antonio, the mayor. Jorge recognized them. They were no strangers to the town, known for their unsubtle methods of solving problems. Jorge turned off the lights in his cabin, trying to remain unnoticed. With his heart pounding, he approached a crack to spy. The men were inspecting the ground where he had first buried the suitcase. "They're looking for something, but how do they know?" he muttered to himself. He decided not to move or make a sound. If he was discovered, he would have no way to explain his connection to the money. That night, the cabin became a prison of fear and suspicion. Meanwhile, Mariana continued her investigation. She had reviewed documents and conducted interviews in the town, and a connection began to form in her mind. The missing funds from the mayor's office, the deceased businessman, and now the behavior of the suspect. The Gravedigger's strange story. Something tied the pieces together, but he still couldn't figure it out. He decided to return to the cemetery that night, hoping to find more clues. Jorge knew he couldn't go on like this. Every night brought new sounds, new shadows, and a growing sense of danger. He had made a mistake taking that suitcase, but it was too late now to get rid of it without arousing suspicion. He couldn't bury it again without risking being seen, and he couldn't leave it in the cabin either. As the hours passed, he heard a different noise, a car engine approaching. This time it was Mariana. The journalist parked near the entrance and with her flashlight in hand, began walking among the tombstones. Jorge watched her from afar, hidden among the trees. "What is she doing here at this hour?" he thought, his self-preservation instincts kicking in. He saw her stop near the abandoned crypt, the suitcase's new hiding place. His heart skipped a beat. He can't find her. Mariana, however, had no idea of the suitcase's existence. She was focused on recording details about the businessman buried there. But something in the air made her uneasy. She felt there was more to that cemetery than she could see. Without realizing it, her presence increased Jorge's paranoia, who watched her every move from the shadows. That night, they both left without clear answers, but with a shared certainty. The cemetery held secrets, and the hidden truths would soon come to light. Mariana returned to the cemetery at dawn, determined to investigate further. Something about the place didn't fit. Jorge's uneasiness, the men she had seen lurking around in the night, and the strange silence that seemed to surround everything. She walked slowly between the tombstones, with her recorder on, hoping to capture some detail that would help her connect the pieces. Jorge, for his part, had spent the night awake. The sounds, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched had intensified. Now as he worked, his movements were erratic, clumsy. Guilt consumed him, but so did fear. What would happen if someone else found the suitcase? In a moment of desperation, he made a risky decision. That same afternoon, he planned to return part of the money anonymously, hoping that this would divert the suspicions he felt growing around him. Meanwhile, Mariana was inspecting the abandoned crypt. There she found something she hadn't expected. Small marks on the ground, as if someone had recently dug. Her heart beat faster. She took out her camera and took pictures. Although there was no concrete evidence, her intuition told her that the cemetery was hiding something important. She decided to confront Jorge directly. She found him later, silently cleaning a tombstone. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" he asked, tape recorder ready. Jorge looked up, visibly nervous. "Strange? No, nothing that I know of," he replied, avoiding eye contact. Mariana was not convinced. The tension on Jorge's face was evident, but she decided not to press him further, at least for the moment. She knew that, sooner or later, the answers would come to light. That night, Jorge left his cabin with a small package wrapped in cloth. A portion of the money. He walked to the town square and left it in front of the church, confident that no one would see it. When he returned, he felt a slight relief, but his relief was short-lived. By the next morning, news of the mysterious, anonymous package had spread throughout the town. Instead of dispelling suspicions, it had heightened everyone's interest, including Antonio, who became convinced that someone at the cemetery was involved. Meanwhile, Mariana was looking through her notes and photographs. She had found clues that Jorge might be connected to something bigger, but she was also beginning to have doubts. His eyes and behavior were not those of a criminal. Rather, they seemed like those of a man trapped in a situation he couldn't handle. She decided to investigate more about Antonio and his relationship with the deceased businessman. Meanwhile, Jorge returned to his routine at the cemetery, trying to avoid the inquisitive glances of the neighbors. However, every step he took made him feel more cornered. The suitcase was still an unbearable weight, and now, with Mariana and Antonio's men around, he knew he was at the center of something that was out of his control. The sound of firm footsteps echoed through the cemetery. Jorge raised his head and saw Antonio walking towards him. The mayor, in his perfectly pressed suit, was out of place with the desolation of the place. However, he was not alone. Two burly men accompanied him, and their serious faces made it clear that they had not come by chance. Jorge felt the air grow heavier with each step they took. "Jorge," Antonio said with a knowing smile, "we need to talk." Jorge swallowed, trying to remain calm. "Sure, Mr. Mayor, how can I help you?" Antonio watched him in silence for a moment, assessing his every move. "I've heard rumors, Jorge. Rumors about something very valuable buried here. And well, you spend more time here than anyone else. I'm sure you know something." Jorge shook his head quickly, feeling sweat running down his back. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. This is just a cemetery, nothing more." Antonio laughed softly, but his eyes remained cold. "I hope you're telling the truth, Jorge, because if I find out that you know something and you don't tell me, well, things could get complicated for you." The mayor's words were a veiled threat, and Jorge knew it. Later, while cleaning the tombstones, Jorge noticed that Antonio's men had not left. They were searching the graves, apparently looking for something. The pressure was unbearable. He felt like every move he made was being watched. That night, he decided to return to the crypt to check that the suitcase was still there. As he moved through the shadows, one thought kept tormenting him. How much longer could he keep this secret? Meanwhile, Mariana also felt that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. She had found evidence linking Antonio to the deceased businessman and the missing money. But her investigation was taking her back to the cemetery, where everything seemed to be connected. When she arrived, she found Jorge in front of the crypt, his face grim. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Mariana asked, approaching cautiously. Jorge was startled, but didn't answer right away. After a few seconds of silence, he finally said, "I'm trapped, you know? There are things I don't understand, but I can't ignore them." Mariana saw something in his gaze, a weight that was crushing him. She decided not to press him further. Instead, she offered something unexpected. "Maybe I can help you, but you need to trust me." Jorge wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he also knew he couldn't face Antonio alone. That night at Jorge's cabin, they began sharing information. Mariana told him about the embezzlement and how Antonio was involved. Jorge, while not confessing the existence of the suitcase, hinted that he had found something that had put him in danger. They both knew that facing Antonio would be risky, but they were reaching a point where they had no other choice. The moon dimly illuminated the cemetery as Mariana mentally reviewed the notes she had accumulated on Antonio. Each detail reinforced her theory. The mayor had diverted the funds from the town hall, using the deceased businessman as an intermediary, but something crucial was still missing: hard evidence to expose him. Sitting in front of Jorge's cabin, she watched the gravedigger warily. There was something he wasn't saying. "We need a plan," Mariana finally said, breaking the silence. Jorge, who was sitting with his hands clasped together, sighed deeply. "Antonio won't stop until he finds what he's looking for," he murmured. The journalist stared at him. "What if we expose him? We use what he's looking for to lure him out. It could be our only chance." Jorge looked up, his eyes filled with doubt. He knew Mariana was suggesting using the suitcase as bait. Although he was terrified by the idea, he also felt he couldn't hide any longer. "If we do this, there'll be no turning back," he warned. Mariana nodded. "I know, but it's the only way to stop him." That same night, the two began to draw up a plan. Jorge, using his knowledge of the cemetery, proposed a specific place for the ambush: the abandoned crypt. There they could manipulate the terrain in their favor, ensuring that Antonio was trapped. Mariana would be in charge of recording everything with her camera, looking to capture a confession or an act that would directly incriminate him. The plan was risky, but Jorge knew he couldn't continue living with that weight on his shoulders. That same night, they dug up the suitcase and placed it in a visible place inside the crypt. As they worked, the wind blew hard, and the familiar sounds of the cemetery seemed to follow them. Jorge couldn't help but look over his shoulder, feeling that something else was watching them. "Are you sure about this?" Mariana asked as she placed her camera in a strategic corner. Jorge nodded, although his expression reflected a clear internal conflict. "If this fails, we're lost," he muttered. By dawn, rumors about the mysterious anonymous package in the church continued to grow in the village. Antonio, enraged, redoubled his efforts to find the responsible. When he received an anonymous note directing him to the cemetery that very night, he did not hesitate to accept the invitation. "If anyone thinks they can make fun of me, they're in for a surprise," he thought, as he gathered his men for the meeting. Jorge and Mariana waited silently inside the crypt, their hearts beating in unison. As the lights of the flashlights began to illuminate the entrance, they both braced themselves for what was to come. "This is the moment," Mariana whispered, adjusting her camera. Jorge, armed only with a shovel, took a deep breath. The footsteps drew closer, and Antonio's figure emerged from the shadows. "Here's what I was looking for," Jorge said loudly, attracting the mayor's attention. Everything was ready for the buried truth to finally come to light. The rain fell in a soft but constant murmur, enveloping the cemetery in an even more somber atmosphere. Jorge and Mariana hid behind a tombstone near the crypt, their bodies tense and alert. From a distance, the flashlights of Antonio and his men cut through the darkness like blades, advancing slowly toward the trap they had prepared. Antonio, protected by a black umbrella, led the group with a satisfied smile. "They're here." "I know it," he murmured, his eyes scanning every corner of the cemetery. His two armed men moved silently, covering each flank. When they reached the entrance to the crypt, Antonio raised his hand, indicating for them to stop. There it was, the suitcase in the center of the crypt, open and revealing the neatly arranged bundles of bills. "I knew he would show up sooner or later," Antonio said loudly, his tone heavy with triumph. As one of his men moved closer to inspect the suitcase, Mariana adjusted her camera, making sure to capture every detail. Jorge, his nerves on edge, held his shovel tightly, prepared for any eventuality. Suddenly, the man checking the suitcase shouted, "It's empty!" Antonio whipped around, his expression turning from triumph to anger. "What kind of joke is this?" he roared, his voice echoing in the crypt. It was then that Jorge stepped out of the shadows. "Were you looking for this, Antonio?" Jorge said, holding a wad of bills in one hand. Mariana, still hidden, recorded every second. Antonio advanced towards him with firm steps, ignoring the rain that soaked his suit. "I knew it was you," he said with a venomous smile. "I always knew that gravediggers hid more secrets than they seemed to." "And you were always hiding something worse," Jorge replied, his voice shaking but firm. Antonio stopped, surprised by the gravedigger's audacity. "Be careful what you say, Jorge. You don't want to get into trouble you can't handle." Jorge took a step back, his breathing quickened. "Trouble has already found me, but I'm not going to let you continue destroying this city." As he spoke, Mariana continued recording, focusing her camera on the mayor's face. Antonio laughed. "And what are you going to do? Bury me like you do with the dead?" At that moment, one of Antonio's men saw the glow of Mariana's camera. "There's someone there!" he shouted, pointing into the shadows. Mariana, left with no choice, stepped out of her hiding spot, the camera still recording. Antonio looked at her, his smile fading. "Mariana, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The tension was broken when Jorge threw a wad of bills onto the ground, letting the wind and rain scatter them. "This is all yours, isn't it? The money you stole from the town." Antonio, in a fit of rage, lunged at Jorge, but Jorge reacted quickly, using the shovel to block the attack. The fight that followed was chaotic. Jorge, fueled by adrenaline, used his work tools to defend himself, while Antonio's men tried to surround him. Mariana, meanwhile, did not stop recording, capturing every word, every blow. "This is the man who destroyed the town," she shouted, hoping her words would echo beyond the cemetery. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the chaos. Antonio stopped, looking towards the cemetery entrance. The authorities, alerted by Mariana beforehand, arrived just in time. With cameras on and officers armed, the mayor had no choice but to surrender. Jorge, soaked and exhausted, collapsed to the ground. The storm was over, but he knew that the consequences of that night were just beginning. The morning after the confrontation at the cemetery dawned with a different air in the town. The news of Antonio's capture had spread like wildfire, and Mariana's recordings were now irrefutable proof of his corruption. The suitcase of money displayed as evidence became a symbol of the rotten system that Antonio had built. But for Jorge, that morning brought a mix of relief and exhaustion. Sitting on the threshold of his cabin, Jorge watched as the town slowly returned to normal. Some neighbors who had previously looked at him with suspicion now gave him gestures of gratitude as he passed by. However, Jorge knew there was nothing to celebrate. He had lost more than he had gained, and the weight of what had happened still weighed heavily on him. Mariana arrived shortly after, with her notebook in one hand and a slight smile on her face. "I didn't think you'd agree to talk to me after all this," she said, sitting down next to him. Jorge sighed, looking out into the distance. "I don't know what else is left to say. I did what I had to do. Nothing more." "What you did was more than anyone expected," Mariana replied, placing her notebook on her knees. "Thanks to you, Antonio is in jail, and the town has a chance to start over." Jorge didn't respond immediately. He knew Mariana was right, but he still felt the weight of his decision to take the suitcase in the first place. "I just hope that this time things really change," he murmured. Antonio, protected by a black umbrella, led the group with a satisfied smile. "They're here." "I know it," he murmured, his eyes scanning every corner of the cemetery. His two armed men moved silently, covering each flank. When they reached the entrance to the crypt, Antonio raised his hand, indicating for them to stop. There it was, the suitcase in the center of the crypt, open and revealing the neatly arranged bundles of bills. "I knew he would show up sooner or later," Antonio said loudly, his tone heavy with triumph. As one of his men moved closer to inspect the suitcase, Mariana adjusted her camera, making sure to capture every detail. Jorge, his nerves on edge, held his shovel tightly, prepared for any eventuality. Suddenly, the man checking the suitcase shouted, "It's empty!" Antonio whipped around, his expression turning from triumph to anger. "What kind of joke is this?" he roared, his voice echoing in the crypt. It was then that Jorge stepped out of the shadows. "Were you looking for this, Antonio?" Jorge said, holding a wad of bills in one hand. Mariana, still hidden, recorded every second. Antonio advanced towards him with firm steps, ignoring the rain that soaked his suit. "I knew it was you," he said with a venomous smile. "I always knew that gravediggers hid more secrets than they seemed to." "And you were always hiding something worse," Jorge replied, his voice shaking but firm. Antonio stopped, surprised by the gravedigger's audacity. "Be careful what you say, Jorge. You don't want to get into trouble you can't handle." Jorge took a step back, his breathing quickened. "Trouble has already found me, but I'm not going to let you continue destroying the city." As he spoke, Mariana continued recording, focusing her camera on the mayor's face. Antonio laughed. "And what are you going to do? Bury me like you do with the dead?" At that moment, one of Antonio's men saw the glow of Mariana's camera. "There's someone there!" he shouted, pointing into the shadows. Mariana, left with no choice, stepped out of her hiding spot, the camera still recording. Antonio looked at her, his smile fading. "Mariana, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The tension was broken when Jorge threw a wad of bills onto the ground, letting the wind and rain scatter them. "This is all yours, isn't it? The money you stole from the town." Antonio, in a fit of rage, lunged at Jorge, but Jorge reacted quickly, using the shovel to block the attack. The fight that followed was chaotic. Jorge, fueled by adrenaline, used his work tools to defend himself, while Antonio's men tried to surround him. Mariana, meanwhile, did not stop recording, capturing every word, every blow. "This is the man who destroyed the town," she shouted, hoping her words would echo beyond the cemetery. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the chaos. Antonio stopped, looking towards the cemetery entrance. The authorities, alerted by Mariana beforehand, arrived just in time. With cameras on and officers armed, the mayor had no choice but to surrender. Jorge, soaked and exhausted, collapsed to the ground. The storm was over, but he knew that the consequences of that night were just beginning. The morning after the confrontation at the cemetery dawned with a different air in the town. The news of Antonio's capture had spread like wildfire, and Mariana's recordings were now irrefutable proof of his corruption. The suitcase of money displayed as evidence became a symbol of the rotten system that Antonio had built. But for Jorge, that morning brought a mix of relief and exhaustion. Sitting on the threshold of his cabin, Jorge watched as the town slowly returned to normal. Some neighbors who had previously looked at him with suspicion now gave him gestures of gratitude as he passed by. However, Jorge knew there was nothing to celebrate. He had lost more than he had gained, and the weight of what had happened still weighed heavily on him. Mariana arrived shortly after, with her notebook in one hand and a slight smile on her face. "I didn't think you'd agree to talk to me after all this," she said, sitting down next to him. Jorge sighed, looking out into the distance. "I don't know what else is left to say. I did what I had to do. Nothing more." "What you did was more than anyone expected," Mariana replied, placing her notebook on her knees. "Thanks to you, Antonio is in jail, and the town has a chance to start over." Jorge didn't respond immediately. He knew Mariana was right, but he still felt the weight of his decision to take the suitcase in the first place. "I just hope that this time things really change," he murmured. With Antonio incarcerated, authorities began to recover some of the embezzled funds, including the bills found in the suitcase. The press, led by Mariana, transformed the case into a national call against corruption. Their articles detailed not only the mayor's crimes, but also the bravery of a gravedigger who, caught in a web of secrets, decided to face his own fears to expose the truth. In the village, Jorge became an unexpected figure of respect, but he was uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm not a hero," he would tell anyone who congratulated him. "I just did what was necessary." Mariana understood his need to remain in the shadows, but she also saw in him something that Jorge himself did not recognize, a strength that had inspired others. Finally, one day, Jorge made his decision. He packed his few belongings into a backpack and walked to the cemetery for the last time. He looked at the tombstones and crypts, the places that had been his refuge and his prison. Before he left a shovel against a tombstone as a gesture of farewell. Mariana caught up with him at the entrance to the village. "Are you sure you want to leave?" she asked, knowing the answer was obvious. Jorge nodded. "This place needs a fresh start, and so do I." As he walked away, Mariana watched him disappear over the horizon, his camera hanging from his neck and his notebook in his hand. She knew that his story did not end there, neither for the town nor for Jorge. The fight against corruption that they had both started now belonged to everyone. Mariana's final article ended with a phrase that would resonate far beyond the town. "Sometimes shadows don't hide monsters, but heroes who have not yet found their light." Sometimes the smallest decisions can trigger the biggest consequences. Jorge discovered that carrying a secret not only weighs on your conscience, but can also attract the shadows of ambition and danger. What would you have done in his place? Would you have returned the money from the beginning, or used it to change your life, no matter the risks? The story reminds us that the truth, no matter how terrifying, always finds a way to come out. Click on the video on screen to continue your own journey of self-discovery, and reflect on how decisions, even the most difficult ones, can shape our lives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, intrigue, and invite us to question the world around us. See you in the next video.